Hey everybody, Brian here from quantlabs.net. Okay, so today in this video I want to cover something called liquidity coverage of the US Fed. Alright, so what does it mean? I'll just read you the first sentence. Liquidity coverage ratio refers to liquid assets, obviously the US Fed Treasury, held by financial institutions to meet short-term obligations. Now, of course, the Fed is able to print money as much as it wants. As they called it, quantitative easing to infinity. This QE1 all the way through QE4. So let me show you the chart. My little script that generates this. Now, the interesting thing is I want you to pay attention to the dips. Here in 82. This will probably be early 90s, which I remember vividly. And then, of course, the 2008-9 meltdown that we've had about 8 years ago. So when you look at this and this, again, remember early 80s, early 90s. All right, so if I pull up the historical GDP according to the chart at Quandl and compare it. Okay, where is, we want that one. Okay, so let's shrink this puppy down. Okay, so as I said, if we look at the early 80s and around here, you can see that the GDP just suddenly shot up and liquidity shot up. Now, the GDP was what rescued the economy in the US back in the day. And you can see how high the GDP went up to, well over 6. Actually, it went up to 7.26, as you can see there. So then we move forward to the early 90s, right here. So we're talking from here to here. You can see the GDP sort of hovered, kind of, in a way, got up to about 4. Okay? So they were obviously pumping money into the economy back in the day. And I'm sure if I pulled up the debt levels, it would show that. Maybe I should do that. Let's see. Where is my debt level? Let me see here. Okay, so if I do a Google search for Fed, GDP, no, we want debt. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look for the debt of the US government. Maybe total public debt. So here's a chart. So you can see here, if I pull up this chart here, very low up until the 80s. So they probably did a little bit of pumping money into the economy around here in the early 80s. So it was reasonable, right? Let me quit this program here. All right, so knowing that early 80s, they pumped a little bit of printed money into the economy in the early 80s. So when we move into the early 90s, it starts to elevate quite a bit. As you can see here, but there's very little effect. Historically, it worked in the early 80s where the GDP shot up. But when they start pumping money into the economy, the Fed that is, what they're relying on is that the GDP takes hold and the economy restarts itself to sort of get things rolling again. And that's what the liquidity measures, is the quantitative easing programs. So it sort of worked. If I go back to the GDP chart, you can see that it dipped. And then it sort of shot up to around 4, and it consistently stayed around 4 for a while. And then about in this time period, that's when outsourcing became a big deal, okay? And it still took off, not took off, but it still stabilized around 4 for the GDP here, right? So what they did was it was still be able to recover somewhat on its own. So as you can see here, it started to dwindle or trend down up until 2010, which is part of the big meltdown. And that can easily be verified in this chart right here. So you can just see it just trended down on the liquidity level. So the economy really tanked because the GDP was so low. The government had to pump in a lot of money, quantitative easing like crazy, to recover the economy. Okay? So when you look at the economy here, it's no longer at 6, as in the early 80s. It's no longer 4. The GDP now is hovering in around 2, which means the GDP is trending down. And as they pump more money into the economy, it's just not working historically as it did in the early 80s. So when you look at the chart here, no, we don't want that one. We want this one. So when you look at the chart, this recovery did not take place. I mean, you don't need to be a PhD or a rocket science to see that. Historically, it worked here instantly. Historically, it did not work here because outsourcing was starting to kick in, so the productivity wasn't as high. Therefore, the GDP was a lot lower. But still, kind of took roughly maybe 4 years for it to really kick in, for about another 5 years, which worked well. But companies were still outsourcing. So now outsourcing comes along. There's no jobs. China pretty well takes a lot of the traditional U.S. manufacturing jobs, so the U.S. GDP suffers. We've talked about that. So the Fed and the U.S. government are somewhat in trouble. Now, I don't know if you've seen this headline. This just came out this morning. Ford moves all small car production to Mexico. That's today. Okay, Ford to move all small car production to Mexico from the U.S. 3 hours ago. Today being September 14, 2016. So when you get companies as big as Ford, manufacturing-wise, outsourcing those jobs again, there's going to be fewer jobs in the U.S. economy. Manufacturing, good manufacturing jobs. So that GDP still continues to grind down. So what happens? Well, this is what happens. Your Fed, your debt levels go crazy, right? And this is what's starting to happen, because now that the GDP has gone bonkers, or sorry, the debt level has gone bonkers, what's left? Okay, let's take a look at the chart that I generated, the liquidity coverage. Okay, now that's all fine and good. Thankfully, from George on my Facebook, who's local to me, discovered this chart. There's another important chart because this is the bill of the interest of the debt the U.S. has, which is now the largest amount that is taken out of the U.S. budget, but no one ever talks about it. It's bigger than the military budget because somebody has to cover the interest bill for the debt. And as you can see here, it is trending down, is what you want. So they're kind of getting to it, but there's going to have to be sacrifices, entitlements, and whatnot. But just economically, it's the only way. You cannot continue to have debt at this level. It's just not possible. So I thought I'd put that together for you. But the real interesting one is this liquidity. As liquidity does come down, the U.S. government is pumping money, but there's a cost. And that's the cost right there, the debt level. You cannot hide that. And what they try to do with the Fed is try to repackage the data. But this data does continue, and it can be found thanks to guys like George. So happy to report I've got better coverage, better analysis done on the Fed. Trying to showcase it to you. Doesn't look pretty, and we deal with that. All right, have a good day.